Chapter 621, Governor General's Office Banquet Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios Admiral Emirius Revolt. A true demigod. Upon hearing Bilt's reveal, a few words immediately appeared in Klein's mind. "I'm sorry." "Bye." Gehrman Sparrow pricked up his brows slightly as Bilt hurried to explain, this wouldn't influence the difficulty of the mission. There's no need for anyone to display a demigod's powers throughout the duration of the mission. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. To make the mission not as difficult, His Excellency has specially arranged for him to inspect the Oravi naval base for a few days. This way, he doesn't need to stay in the Central Sonia Seas Navy headquarters, the City of Generosity, Byam. As such, he will avoid Sea King John Cotman and the Governor-General of the Rorstad Archipelago, George Negan. He would avoid most of the subordinates he's familiar with, and he'll avoid his family who operates the family estate over there. He will also avoid his mistress who he's most familiar with. That is to say that you wouldn't need to face demigods, or the test of the masses. Here, there will only be 3 people who are familiar with His Excellency. The first is his secretary, Lieutenant Colonel Wan. He belongs to MI9, and he's in charge of monitoring His Excellency. He likely uses many names, and I'm not sure which is his real name. The second person will be the local mistress His Excellency has here, a beautiful lady by the name of Cynthia. It's said that her ancestor was a noble before his title was stripped, and his family was exiled here. The third person is Oravi's Governor-General, Aston Revolt, the youngest brother of His Excellency. Earl Revolt from the House of Lords is their elder brother. It really doesn't sound too difficult. Besides, my divination results tell me that it's not too dangerous. Klein fell silent for a few seconds before nodding gently. I need the detailed information regarding Emirius Revolt. We've already prepared everything. This is his photograph. These are the descriptions of any unique traits hidden on his body. These are the unique points of his accent. These are the common words he uses. These are the different reactions and attitudes he has towards different matters. Here is the detailed information regarding his interactions with Luan, Cynthia, and Aston. Bilt was delighted as he produced all the information he received from Admiral Emirius Revolt. Klein first took the photograph and saw a middle-aged gentleman with black hair and blue eyes. He had a strict and old-fashioned demeanor, and his hair was a lot more voluminous than most lone men. He nodded indiscernibly before looking up. I know this is a lot of information, but I believe that you can memorize them all in 2 days. You have to be very professional in such matters. Before Bilt finished his sentence, he subconsciously took a step back because the person before him wasn't Gehrman Sparrow but Emirius Revolt. The strict and arrogant vibes he exuded was no different from the actual person. Holy Lord of Storms, this is almost a miracle. Bilt looked him up and down, and he couldn't help but be amazed. However, you can be another 3 centimeters taller. Your legs can be thicker. But it's fine, there's no rush. His Excellency will arrive the day after tomorrow with the Imperial Navy's 1st Central Sonia Fleet. He would inspect the Oravi naval base in the morning and attend a banquet held at the Governor-General's office. I have an invitation to it, and I can bring you there. You can watch from His Excellency's actions and the way he interacts with different people from the side. As he spoke, he received the £500 that Sothoth had taken out from the safe. He handed it to Klein and said, I hope for a pleasant partnership. Klein weighed the notes in his hand and studied it with a few glances before saying, I hope for a pleasant partnership. Backlund, William Street. As an inconspicuous member of the Red Gloves, Leonard Mitchell leaned on the outer wall of a house, awaiting the preliminary investigation work to end. He had his right leg raised slightly, with only his toes to the ground. It made him look desultory. After a while, he saw his teammate return with a somewhat complex expression. He was excited, puzzled, expectant, and nervous. Thompson, is there a conclusion? Leonard's heart stirred as he leaned over with a smile. Yeah, Thompson nodded and answered frankly. Both sides have spoken the truth. They have no way of lying in their dreams. Thompson, with his thin hair, wore his top hat once again. Their descriptions are uniform. Beneath this street is a ruin belonging to the 4th epoch's Tudor dynasty. The entrance is indeed that abandoned chapel. No one knows if there's another entrance for now. Is that so? Leonard didn't delve into the details as he exchanged a few words before moving to the sidelines. Once again, he leaned against the wall. He looked around and suppressed his voice. "Old man, this is what you're good at. There's a Tudor family ruin hidden here." An elderly voice rang out in his mind. "You're becoming more and more impolite. In our era, disrespect to high-ranking people implies being made into living sacrifices. Also, it's impossible for there to only be one Tudor family ruin in Backlund." "Are they lying?" Leonard asked softly. The elderly voice chuckled and said, "No, they just don't know enough. If my theories are correct, this ruin likely belongs to the Tudor Trunsoist United Empire." "What?" Leonard was stunned. This was an ancient dynasty he had never heard of before. The slightly aged voice chuckled. "What an unknowledgeable kid. After the Solomon Empire was first destroyed, it was replaced by the Tudor Trunsoist United Empire. Its double consul ruled all of the northern continent." Double consul, Leonard ruminated over this phrase. The slightly aged voice chuckled and sighed. "In the ruins underground, there should be 41 inverted candlesticks on the left and 40 on the right. 2 of them look like they belong to the throne of a giant, and heh. It might be where Alista Tudor became Blood Emperor." Leonard frowned slightly before easing them. He said with a relaxed smile, "There must be quite a lot of secrets hidden in there." "Of course, but you aren't qualified to know it." The slightly aged voice sked. Leonard curled his lips indiscernibly and said, "What follows next is the exploration of the ruins." The slightly aged voice chuckled before falling silent. A minute later, Leonard saw Archbishop St. Anthony and the Church of Steam's Archbishop Horimic end their conversation as they returned to their own camps. Immediately following that, Horimic ordered all machinery hive mind personnel to leave, leaving the area to the Church of the Evernight Goddesses Nighthawks. What happened? Upon seeing this scene, Leonard was filled with puzzlement. At that moment, all the Nighthawks heard Archbishop St. Anthony's voice. "All red gloves gather. The other Nighthawks are to leave the mirror world. Find a reason to evacuate all the residents in the area, and promise them compensation for their property. After all the residents evacuate, the Red Gloves and I will destroy this ruin that stems from an evil era. Entry is forbidden. It will be directly destroyed. May the goddess bless us all." This. Leonard never expected such a development. 7:30 in the evening, at the Oravi Governor General's office. Klein changed into Sothatha's appearance. He wore a black tailcoat and a bow tie of the same color. He followed Bilt into the banquets hall. The temperature inside was like that of spring. A gigantic chandelier hung from the ceiling, and the shimmering candlelight illuminated the grounds like it was daytime. In the corner on the right, there were musicians dressed in vests and bow ties playing a brisk tune. On the left were long tables. On top were roasted chicken, pan-fried foie gras, stewed lamb, Backlund-styled roasted goose, Odora lobsters with butter and cheese, and other delicacies. Despite the distance, Klein could still catch a whiff of the fragrance wafting over. He planned on getting a plate and filling it with food. At this moment, Bilt tugged at his collar in a reserved manner. He leaned his head over and suppressed his voice. "Remember the etiquette as required by such banquets. Our current goal is to observe His Excellency's actions, so just taking a cup of wine would do. There's Misty champagne here, Ormer grape wine, and Southville red wine, all famous alcohols that are seldom seen outside. You can drink some, but not a lot. We have to maintain sufficient sobriety. Yes, try to just go through the motions when drinking." Klein retracted his gaze and nodded. The two of them took a cup of golden champagne, whose minute bubbles were like mist, from a red-vested waiter who passed by them. Then, they moved towards the banquet's highlight, where Emerius Revolt stood wearing his dark blue Navy Admiral's uniform. With their standing, they naturally had no way of approaching the Admiral. All they could do was observe his every action from a slight distance. Emerius's figure is normal. It doesn't look that fit. The corners of his mouth droops a little, indicating his actual age. He doesn't have a beard. His blue eyes seem to hide an authority that one cannot reject or defend against. His dark blue admiral uniform is starched well. There's a red lanyard at his shoulder, which joins to his chest where there are all sorts of medals. His sleeves have golden cuff links, accentuating his epaulets of the same color. His epaulets are split into 3 parts. From inside out, there's an embedded crown with rubies, the crossed scepter and sword, for stars made of diamonds. Klein began scrutinizing and used his faceless powers to memorize all the detailed characteristics of the Navy Admiral, as well as the attitude he used when talking to different people. During this process, he only took a sip of the misty champagne and didn't take note of its taste. After he had mostly gathered all the information, Klein exhaled and allowed his mind to rest. The great drain on his mind made him hungry. Hence, he placed the wine cup on the tray of a red-vested waiter, and he planned to get some food from the long table. At this moment, Bilt leaned over and said, "His Excellency has given me the signal. We will be meeting him at an agreed location." Klein retracted his gaze from the roasted chicken and swept a cold glance at Bilt. Bilt shuddered as he hurriedly turned around, leading Gehrman Sparrow from the floor-to-ceiling window and into the garden. After walking for nearly a minute in the secluded path, he paused and pointed at Klein's face. "You can change into His Excellency's appearance. Just pretend that you're that tramp who looks like him." Klein nodded gently and extended his palm to wipe his face. He did so to conceal the disgusting tendrils and granules that might appear on his face while changing his appearance. By the time he lowered his palm, Bilt saw a middle-aged gentleman who looked somewhat like Emerius Revolt. "Very good." Bilt took a few steps forward and came to the entrance of a sundries room. He extended his hand and pushed open the unlocked door. Emerius Revolt was still wearing the eye-catching admiral's uniform. His body was standing sideways to the door as he observed the garden outside by the window. At this moment, he turned his head and cast his gaze onto the person who resembled him. The indescribable pressure and might made Klein involuntarily lower his head. Emerius Revolt's gaze didn't stop there as it slowly moved to Bilt. He said, without any tinge of emotion, "This isn't the tramp you mentioned before. He's a beyonder." Chapter 622, Temporary Contract Translator, Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. Upon hearing Emerius Revolt's descriptive words which weren't a question, Bilt's forehead instantly broke out into a cold sweat. He turned agape, hoping to explain himself, but finally, he plopped to his knees and said under the indescribable pressure, "Admiral, Your Excellency, the tramp from before suddenly died of an illness. I had no choice but to find an adventurer who can shape-shift." At this moment in time, Klein wasn't too nervous. This was because Emerius Revolt had already noticed him during the banquet. There was no reason for him to only recognize him as a beyonder only now. For him to agree to their meeting and not directly avoid the risk meant that he didn't mind who Bilt had hired. Not worried at all. This is the confidence of a demigod, otherwise, his beyonder pathway is able to avert disaster ahead of time. Klein raised his head with great difficulty as he cast his gaze towards the Navy Admiral beside him. "Quite strong," Emerius Revolt commented without an expression. He continued looking at the genuflecting Bilt and said, "Do not try to use your under-the-table smarts in front of me. An ordinary person and a beyonder in this world are different, and I'm a follower of order, making me be able to be certain of this. Of course, it's identical to what's written in the information. This admiral is inclined to expounding on certain things. I have to remember this point. This is a completely different style from me and Gehrman Sparrow. Klein retracted his gaze in thought as he cast it to the ground as if he was unable to withstand the pressure. Amirius Revolt took one step forward. Lying is the first mistake you committed. Not being cautious is the second. A tramp you spent a great deal of effort on to groom had suddenly died, and all of a sudden, an adventurer who can shape-shift appears in front of you. Don't you find it a coincidence? Yes, it's quite coincidental. Klein nearly said the same thing. If not for his confirmation above the gray fog, he would have suspected if he was being set up by a legendary creature or a Grade 0 sealed artifact. Bilt's pupils constricted as he snapped to his senses. He discovered that due to his horror and fear, all he thought about was to grasp at the final life-saving straw. He had lost the caution brought about from his experience, having not considered whether Gehrman Sparrow's appearance was a coincidence or not. The tramp had suddenly died on the day he arrived at the Sweet Lemon Bar. The more Bilt thought about it, the more he felt as though he had fallen for some intricately planned trap. As Amirius Revolt watched Bilt's expression change with enlightenment and regret, he nodded gently and said, "My father, the deceased Earl Revolt, once taught me this. He said to pardon the first mistake of a subordinate. Bilt, you should be thankful for his benevolence." Bilt's tense mood eased instantly as he felt extremely moved. He thought Amirius Revolt, who was closer to a god than man, would execute him on the spot, so as to warn all the adventurers who were under him. Who knew that he would choose to pardon him? "Your Excellency, I." Bilt was momentarily unable to form a sentence. Amirius maintained his stern expression and said in a deep voice, "There's a second half of the saying, that is, punish them for their second mistake. Bilt, do you know what you should do in the future?" The genuflecting Bilt immediately straightened his back and pressed his right fist to his left chest. "I'll be utmost loyal to you, Your Excellency." Amirius nodded and turned to Klein. "What's your name?" "That depends on which identity you're asking about." Klein lampooned inwardly and calmly replied, "Gehrman Sparrow." Amirius Revolt suddenly fell silent for 2 seconds as the atmosphere in the sundry room seemed to freeze. Just as Klein couldn't help but feel uneasy, Amirius finally said, "So it's you." "Your Excellency, you sound as though you know me." "I'm just an ordinary military informant. I only exchanged some bounty through you. I haven't even made any reimbursement claims." Klein silently mumbled as he felt less and less confident. Amirius nodded and said to Bilt and Klein, "The plan will proceed as per normal. However, we need to sign a contract." "A contract?" Klein resisted the pressure with great difficulty as he raised his head to look at Amirius. Amirius didn't provide a further explanation. He lifted up the paper and pen he had long prepared from the window sill and wrote something on it. Every time he made contact with his pen, a golden glow would emit. The solemnity and holiness made it seem like he was penning a law. Klein narrowed his eyes slowly as his vision turned blurry. He couldn't help but lower his head again. After an unknown period of time, Amirius stopped writing and picked up a piece of paper. He said to Klein, "Sign your name at the end. If the conditions aren't satisfactory, you can choose not to sign." "Do you think I have or lack the guts to sign it?" Klein lampooned as he watched Bilt stand up. He received the pen and paper and handed it to Klein. The conditions on the piece of paper were few and simple. Most of them restricted Gehrman Sparrow's actions when acting as Amirius Revolt. It included, but wasn't limited to, voluntarily exposing any problems, not using his identity to engage in acts which were adversarial to Amirius, as well as not make any intimate contact with Miss Cynthia, etc. I thought such important figures wouldn't care about the chastity of their mistresses. This admiral is indeed an old-fashioned man. However, I'm not such a person either. Klein hid his curiosity and asked as though it was an academic question, "What if Miss Cynthia chooses to make intimate contact with me?" In between the lines, he was saying that being too distant or resistant made it easier for Cynthia to notice a problem. He was asking how he should balance the act. It's fine, Amirius said without any expression. During the contract's validity, you will not have any desire or lack the ability to do it when facing her. You can do that? This contract is rather powerful. Apart from a contract with spirit world creatures, this is the first time I'm seeing other contracts. Furthermore, the former used the power of the underworld. This contract is only between two parties. Is this a demigod beyond her power of Admiral Amirius? The Arbiter Pathway. Klein shot a glance at the dates and discovered that it lasted 5 days. Is he confident that he will return within 5 days, or is his level only capable of implementing a contract for 5 days? Klein read the conditions once again before taking the fountain pen and wrote the name, Gehrman Sparrow. With the final character written, he saw the words on the piece of paper emit a golden glow as they condensed into a resplendent luster. Amidst the resplendent luster, the piece of paper rapidly dissipated and vanished, as though it had fused with the world's rules. An invisible and faint grey fog gently rippled around him as Klein clearly sensed layers of indescribable restrictions placed on him. These restrictions quickly melted into his body, temporarily becoming one with his spirit body and physical flesh. The grey fog can block out bad and good luck from external sources to a certain extent, but it's unable to screen a contract I signed. That's right. If it can screen it, the contract with the messenger wouldn't have been valid. Klein gazed at Amirius Revolt once again in enlightenment. The Admiral had already converged his might as he produced a dark gold charm in his palm. On it were the symbols and magical labels representing the Sword of Judgment. Its entire body was converged and somber, giving one the feeling that it was part of a codex. This is a high-level charm using my blood, a 4th epoch ancient codex, and the royal family's grade 0 sealed artifact, Amirius said calmly. Its name is 9th Law. When it's injected with minute amounts of spirituality, it can produce a might that's similar to mine. This can be done even by ordinary people. Without it, you'll find it very difficult to pretend to be me. Indeed, the might I show in a disguised state is only superficial. It's fine fooling others usually, but once there's a need to shock and awe any subordinate, that would be useless. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Amirius continued, with your present strength, you should be able to withstand its usage. Through it, you can indicate a necessary restriction on the target, making them be in an extremely disadvantageous state. This way, even if a demigod were to sound you out, you'll be able to scare him away. If no mishaps happen at the end of everything, and if you had no need to use it, then it will be yours to keep. It can be used for a year. Klein was first taken aback before he felt a strong sense of delight. He finally had another high-level charm ever since that time he used up the one which was created with the mutated sun's sacred emblem. Although such an item had a time limitation and was single-use, a pro was that it didn't have any negative side effects. Of course, the stringent requirements that were needed to create one made them very rare in number. As expected of a demigod. He's a lot more generous than built. Bribing a tramp and an adventurer at the pirate admiral level are different in cost. As Klein thought in happiness, he silently extended his palm and received the high-level charm named 9th Law. Then, he saw Amirius remove his belt. After a brief silence, Klein kept his embarrassment in control as he took off his clothes without an expression on his face. Soon, he had switched clothes with Amirius and had donned the dark blue starched admiral's uniform. After watching Amirius and Bilt walk off through a secluded path in the garden, Klein calmly adjusted his buttons and turned to look at the glass window. Under the dark night and the crimson moonlight, the glass window was like a mirror. It vaguely reflected Klein's present looks. He had black hair which was neatly combed back, blue and profound eyes, slightly drooping cheeks, a beardless face, and an old-fashioned and stern demeanor, all while dressed in a dark blue attire with a lanyard, medals, and epaulets. Klein twitched the corners of his mouth as he silently said to himself, from this moment forth, I'm a Navy Admiral. Chapter 623, First Night Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. As he touched the ninth law charm in his pocket, Klein adjusted his height and details regarding his appearance, making him look identical to Amirius Revolt. He walked out from the sundry room by using another door and walked down a silent corridor, back into the Governor General's office. On the way, waiters and maidservants would occasionally pass by him, but no one dared to look straight at him. Just catching sight of his admiral uniform would have them scurrying to the sides as they bowed with their heads lowered. Any person of the same height could probably find his way into the banquet hall when donning these clothes. I have to say, acting as an important figure can be easier than acting like an ordinary person. Klein continued looking straight as he maintained his somber attitude. He walked towards a path paved with black brick in an unhurried fashion. He soon heard beautiful and melodic music as elegant wall lamps were burning with gas, illuminating the dark environment. Just as Klein approached a break room, he saw a room open. A middle-aged man had been waiting there as he walked over. The man had black hair and blue eyes. His facial features somewhat resemble Amirius, but his forehead was higher and his eye bags were puffy. The corners of his mouth didn't droop. He was none other than Amirius Revolt's youngest brother, Aston Revolt. This gentleman had once served in the navy, and he had been promoted to colonel after rendering meritorious services in the southern continent's colonies. Later, he got sick of his military career, and together with political balance, he agreed to a switch in career and became the Governor General. In the 5 to 6 years he was in Orevy, due to the importance placed on the island's location and resources, he pushed for the Revolt family to mass-purchase farmland and estates, allowing him to own plenty of property. This wasn't completely obtained through his powers either. Aston and the Revolt family had paid a sufficient price, and they even took loans with the bank. It wasn't like the Balam East Coast where land belonging to the Fasak people were forcefully bought at extremely low prices. Of course, if he wasn't Governor General, then Orevy and his elder brother wouldn't be the highest commander of the Central Sonia Seas Navy, and the Revolt family wouldn't have so easily convinced their targets to sell such excellent farmland and estates. Here comes the test. Klein calmly approached and stopped in front of Aston Revolt. Aston looked around and asked in a deep voice, "Have you decided on that matter?" "What matter?" Klein first felt blank before he recalled an introduction in the information he received. If Aston requests for a private chat or asks for an answer to a certain matter, tell him that an answer will be given to him when departing from Orevy. Admiral Amirius really anticipated this. I just need to watch my attitude and tone. Yes, I also need to use the unique terms and pronunciations used by lone aristocrats. Klein gently nodded and sternly said, "Wait a few more days. The answer will be given to you when departing from Orevy." Aston didn't raise any doubts as he chuckled. "You seem to be waiting for something to give you the strength to decide. That matter that Admiral Amirius has to do himself." Klein's heart stirred as he familiarly used the tone of high-level personnel. "Keep your conjectures to yourself." With that said, he took a step forward and walked towards the banquet hall. Aston Revolt focused on his elder brother's back, his expression gradually turning cold. He then shook his head slightly. After entering the banquet hall, Klein surveyed the area and walked towards the long table with food on it. From time to time, he would stop to exchange pleasantries with people who came near him. During this process, he realized that he didn't need to understand the topics raised in any conversation. All he needed to do was nod occasionally, allowing the conversation to harmoniously progress until its end. Indeed, the status of an important figure makes certain aspects of acting easy, but correspondingly, there are certain matters that can be difficult. Klein tore through one obstacle after another before finally arriving at the long table. He casually picked up a plate and told himself that Admiral Amirius liked fish, beef, and lobster, while disliking chicken and goose. Therefore, he avoided food like the roasted chicken and Backlund-styled roasted goose. He picked up some beef, fried dragonbone fish, and Odora lobster with butter and cheese. As the metallic containers had their bottoms lined with asbestos, with red-hot charcoal burning under it or steaming hot water, all of the food maintained an appropriate temperature. Klein nearly broke down, destroying his persona when he took the first bite. He tried his best to maintain Admiral Amirius's image as he held his plate and chatted with the port city's member of parliament, navy suppliers, etc. He seriously listened to what they had to say, stuffing food into his mouth from time to time. He noticed that a young man in a tailcoat kept following behind him. He had neat, blonde hair that he combed backward. He had a receding hairline with light blue eyes. He looked handsome and gentlemanly. Identical to the picture. Amirius's secretary, Juan. Klein controlled himself and didn't size him up. He wanted to fill his stomach before the end of the banquet. Once out of the Governor-General's office, Klein boarded the carriage which was guarded by bodyguards. He sat beside the wine cabinet. The blonde secretary, Juan, followed him in. As his leather boots stepped onto the thick, soft carpet, he silently inched towards a spot opposite Klein. He sat there, but he only occupied a third of the seat. The carriage began moving as Juan took out a stack of documents from the black briefcase he carried. Your Excellency, this is the Orovie Naval Base's ledger for the year 1349. Klein extended his hand over and casually browsed through a few pages. What? £1 for a roll of toilet paper? The naval base's bathroom was renovated 20 times a year. Klein did some simple math and discovered all sorts of ridiculous line items. Isn't accounting such as this way too simple and obvious? I can even give them classes and specially teach them how to make claims. Klein seriously considered the attitude he should show. From his point of view, the greatest difficulty in disguising as Amirius was to fool Juan. This wasn't to say that Governor-General Aston and Miss Cynthia weren't as familiar with Admiral Amirius as his secretary. It was just that, as his younger brother, Aston might help his brother conceal the matter if he discovered something amiss after being given a hint. Similarly, as his mistress, Cynthia would be inclined to help conceal the matter for the Admiral as his dependent. Of course, the possibility that Cynthia was a spy couldn't be eliminated. There was still the matter of there being a chance of being used by a spy, but nothing could be as dangerous as Juan, whose duty was to monitor the Admiral. I can't expose any problems. What kind of attitude would Admiral Amirius have when faced with such a report? Go into a rage, or pretend to be in a rage? No, the Orovie Naval Base personnel wouldn't be that daring to hand over a clearly problematic report as though he were blind. They must have a certain level of confidence and a tacit understanding between them. As the information didn't mention this, Klein could only make a judgment based on his experience. Furthermore, he could confirm that either the Orovie Naval Base's report was beyond Admiral Amirius's expectations or was determined to be of little importance. Just based on the schedule, it was something that could easily be dealt with. Regardless of the possibilities, I have to use the attitude that a person of high standing will usually employ. That is to not indicate my stance. Klein closed the documents and handed it back to the blonde secretary, Juan. He said expressionlessly, "Put it on my desk." In between the lines, this sentence meant, "I'll look through it carefully." To others, it would mean something different based on their standpoints. If the Orovie Naval Base had done it without warning, this meant that the Admiral was somewhat dissatisfied and was awaiting an explanation. If the two had reached a tacit, mutual understanding on the matter, it meant that Admiral Amirius wished to obtain more favorable benefits in the matter. As for whether it would offend anyone, Klein didn't care. After all, he wouldn't be Amirius Revolt in a few days' time. He believed that a true demigod had the means to repress the anger of his subordinates. In addition, he was grateful that Amirius wasn't a demigod of the Church of Storms. Otherwise, he had to consider whether to nod his head and pass the report, or throw the document back in anger while throwing a few people in passing into the sea to feed the fishes. Yes, Your Excellency. The blonde secretary, Juan, didn't change his expression. He stuffed the document back into his black briefcase as though he had long expected such a response. On the way back, Klein leaned into the carriage according to Amirius Revolt's habits. He half closed his eyes as though he was contemplating certain matters, but in fact, he wasn't thinking of anything. Owen maintained his silence and didn't speak at all. Human-height iron-black street lamps were quickly left behind as the carriage drove close to the naval base before taking a bend into a house with a garden and lawn. Just as Klein walked up the steps, a butler opened the door for him as servants lined the two sides, reverently awaiting his entrance. The living room was decorated in a very classic manner. There were oil paintings of beautiful scenery hung up, limestone statues, simple and elegant vases, etc. A faint but lingering fragrance emanated in the room, one that reached into the heart. Klein, who should have relaxed, ended up tensing up as he saw a beautiful lady walk towards him in a home gown. She looked to be in her early 20s. Her blonde hair cascaded down, and when she cast her blue eyes over, it was as though there was a glow hidden within them. While filled with gentle feminineness, there were still some remnants of her youth. She was none other than Admiral Amirius's mistress, Cynthia. Klein held back his discomfort and allowed Amirius's stern face to reveal a smile as he widened his arms. Cynthia threw herself into his arms and tiptoed. With her cheeks by his cheek, she whispered with a smile, "Admiral, I've already heated the water for you in the bathtub." This means she had someone monitor the end of the banquet. Being a mistress isn't something simple either. Admiral Amirius does like to take hot baths so as to relax his thoughts. In order to ignore how close their cheeks were, Klein allowed his thoughts to wander. As a straight man, he should have felt embarrassed while also being rather glad to be approached by such a beautiful member of the opposite sex. However, the temporary contract made him have zero urges. Hence, all that was left was awkwardness. "Very good," Klein praised her as he gently pushed Cynthia away, having had nowhere to place them. Knowing that the Admiral didn't like to be intimate in front of the servants, Cynthia retreated and led Klein to the second floor. He was brought into the bathroom as he prepared a bathrobe for him. After doing all of this, Cynthia instructed the servants not to come to the second floor unless they heard the bell ring. Then, she returned to the bedroom, took off all her clothes and changed into a nightgown made of silk. Her nightgown revealed plenty of her chest. It was an alluring snow white, and deep in her cleavage was a special necklace pendant. It was like a miniaturized black rhinoceros horn about the length of a finger segment. Cynthia took off the necklace and stuffed it under her pillow. Amidst her blushing and hesitation, she left the bedroom and came outside the bathroom where the Admiral was bathing. Mustering her strength, she pulled at the handle. Creak. Her hand paused. She realized that the bathroom's door had been locked from the inside at some point in time. With a blank look, Cynthia instinctively yanked at it again. Creak. Creak. The bathroom's door didn't budge an inch. Chapter 624, Warning Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. The bathroom was partitioned inside. The emanating steam covered the entire bathtub. Apart from his head, Klein's entire body was soaked in the hot water. He lay there in such great comfort that he didn't even wish to move his toes. What a beautiful night. If only there was no Cynthia outside. I still have to deal with her later. Klein sighed as he considered what excuse to use to avoid being intimate with her. In accordance with Admiral Amirius Revolt's traits, he decided to first use work as an excuse. After that would be the excuse of him not feeling well, him losing the ability to have sex, him needing some time to digest any medicine he had just taken, and how he had suddenly realized his true sexual orientation, making him find curly-haired baboons extremely attractive. As for whether this would damage the Admiral's image, Klein didn't feel the slightest bit of pressure. As long as he prevented Cynthia from suspecting that he was a fake Amirius Revolt, he would have perfectly completed his mission. The subsequent explanations for those excuses and how he finds an excuse to explain his recovery would all be Admiral Amirius's problem. What has that got to do with me, Gairman Sparrow? And what has Gairman Sparrow's ruined reputation have to do with me, Sherlock Moriarty? Klein stood up in satisfaction as he walked out to the dry partition while dropping wet. He got a bath towel and dried himself. After changing into a hanging bathrobe, Klein inhaled silently as though he had unlocked a major enemy in his quest. He opened the door to the bathroom. Seeing the corridor empty, with only the light from the wall lamps on both sides illuminating the darkness, Klein felt slightly relieved and was no longer as tensed. This is almost the same feeling as challenging a pirate admiral. As he mumbled, he realized a serious problem. He had no idea which of the rooms was the master bedroom or study. Regardless, I have to inform Cynthia, otherwise, it would make Admiral Amirius appear strange. Klein recalled the layout of similar houses in an attempt to accurately find the master bedroom. At this moment, the door to the room diagonally across him creaked open. Cynthia, who was draped in a silk nightgown, walked over. Her blonde hair appeared wet and messy as they cascaded down. There were even a few strands of hair fluttering in front of her blue eyes and bright red lips. It hid the glow in her eyes as her lips were somewhat closed. She appeared extremely alluring under the dim environment. The neckline of the silk nightgown was very open, as snow-whiteness and a deep cleavage was reflected in Klein's eyes. Klein nearly raised his head to look at the ceiling to avoid the intense stimulation. Calm down, calm down. You are Amirius Revolt. Besides, you've seen a half-naked demoness before. Compared to an ailment maiden, this lady's charms are clearly insufficient. Wait, why am I thinking about demonesses? Who knows if they were formerly men or women? Klein maintained his gaze as he sized her up and down with a teasing tone. In that instant, he could sense that primal desire, but there was no response from his nether regions. This is the result of the temporary contract. In fact, Admiral Amirius didn't need to go through the trouble. Even if I have the urge, I'll be able to control myself. What kind of situation haven't I encountered before? Yes. Cynthia is a little different from what the records say. Isn't it said that she became Amirius's mistress about 1 to 2 years ago? With them not being able to meet each other most of the time, the Admiral has to coax her each time as she hadn't had her pent-up desires fulfilled. Why is she the one taking the initiative today? Does she find her standing as his mistress unstable, or has she been switched? Ever since Klein became a faceless, he felt that everyone was a fake. Cynthia's eyelids were lowered. The courage she had mustered disappeared bit by bit under Amirius's scrutiny. Her face was tainted with a horrified blush. She was embarrassed but also felt some pride. Then, she heard him calmly instruct, "Help me prepare some coffee and place it in my study. I have many things to deal with tonight. You don't have to wait for me." Cynthia raised her head suddenly, her embarrassed blushing still present. She had momentarily failed to understand what Admiral Amirius had said. Klein secretly inhaled and went forward to hug her before kissing her gently on the forehead. "I'll spend lots of time with you in a few days." Such a response came from the provided information, but he had slightly changed the terms. To be frank, if not for him having some prior understanding, Klein would have definitely believed that Admiral Amirius would wear the same stoic face while spending time with his mistress, even when having sex. He looked stern in whatever he said and did. However, this demigod also had his gentle side when it came to his speech. He was just not that great at saying lovey-dovey words. This also made him understand something else: many people could only be viewed from the surface, and it was impossible to imagine what they were like in private. For a faceless to pull off a true disguise, they had to do meticulous investigations and have ample comprehension of the target. This was just like how a magician never performed unprepared. Cynthia revealed a clear look of disappointment, but she quickly restrained those feelings as she smiled. "All right. Admiral, your nightgown is in the room. A bathrobe isn't suitable for handling matters. This is identical to the information. She's rather considerate and knows how to be understanding." Klein watched as Cynthia turned and entered the room. She pulled at the bell. As for him, he took this opportunity to take off his bathrobe and change into a dark red nightgown with trousers of the same color. Cynthia attentively opened the door to the study and tidied up the slightly messy desk. Later, she waited for the maidservant to finish making the coffee before personally taking it and delivering it by hand. During this process, Klein read the documents and information, acting as though he looked extremely professional. But in fact, he had little idea about the data and designs plans of ironclad warships and sail battleships. He was no different from an illiterate. In this domain, all he knew were carriers, air domination, the main cannon guns, and turrets. When he saw Cynthia silently leave and close the door behind her from the corner of his eye, Klein relaxed completely. He knew that he had finally survived the night. Inside the master bedroom, Cynthia pursed her lips as she took out the necklace under her pillow and tightly clasped the item resembling a black rhinoceros horn which was the length of a finger segment. She stood there and silently prayed, "O great mother tree of desire, please, make me more alluring," allowing Admiral Amirius to be even more mesmerized by me, so that he can gain extreme pleasure from me and bear me a child. Inside the quiet study, Klein flipped through the pile of documents placed in front of him. He followed the handling methods according to what the information indicated. He chose the simple ones and signed Amirius Revolt's name on them. The reason why he could mimic his signature was because Faceless allowed him to remember a target's unique traits, while Clown gave him the precise control needed. The complicated ones he couldn't understand had notes written with the following vibe: continue studying the matter. After busying himself until midnight, Klein reached out to cover his mouth and yawned slightly. This won't do. I need to sleep. I have plenty of challenges tomorrow. I have to maintain sufficient strength and energy. Klein thought for a moment and gave up the idea of returning to the master bedroom. He raised his right hand and pressed down on his half-closed eyes. He pulled them down and moved his eyes to his nose bridge. Following that, Klein opened up two slits where Klein's eyes originally were and used his flesh to produce a pair of fake eyes. After becoming a Faceless, I'm really beginning to resemble a monster. If only I had such a godly technique back in school. He sighed silently. He half leaned his body as he kept his real eyes closed while his fake eyes were left open to read the documents. His specialty as a clown allowed him to maintain his balance. He remained motionless like a stone statue. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly awoke from his dream. He sensed that there was a force attempting to pull him into a deep slumber before infiltrating him. Who is it? I didn't do anything recently. Why would anyone enter my dream? That's not right. I'm now Admiral Amirius Revolt. Klein's heart stirred as he immediately changed his looks. Even in his dreams, he appeared to be that demigod. Meanwhile, he felt his consciousness tightly contract as though it was avoiding something. This is different from an ordinary dream infiltration. I've clearly regained my lucidity, and I can escape by myself and wake up, but I'm unable to leave this dreamscape. Klein found plenty of oddities as he tried a few attempts. He knew very well that he was sleeping, and he could sense and control his body outside the dream, but no matter what he did, he was unable to wake up. Right on the heels of that, he saw a blurry white gas form an indiscernible figure. Klein narrowed his eyes slightly as he tore through the dream with his psyche, allowing his real body to move silently. Then, he put his palm into his pocket to touch the ninth law charm. At that moment, the blurry figure calmly said, "Do not participate in the matter regarding Aston. This is a warning." Quite impressive to warn a demigod. What is Aston and the others thinking of doing? Klein thought for a moment and emanated his spirituality, allowing the ninth law charm to produce a deep sense of dominance. Then, he imitated it and produced the same feeling in his dream. He said with a deep voice, "Who are you? Who do you represent?" The blurry figure was taken aback before he said with a laughing sigh, as expected of Law Weaver Amirius. "You actually managed to maintain your lucidity in such a situation." No. Although Amirius has a title of law weaver, he's not adept in such matters. You should say, as expected of Lord Fool. Klein lampooned and sternly said, answer my question. The blurry figure chuckled. You don't need to know who I am. As a demigod, you should be clear that everything is fated, likewise for the times. Do not resist the fate of an era, which is also the trend of the times. This will only make you a sacrifice of history. Fate of an era, the trend of the times, sacrifice of history. When he heard this, Klein suddenly thought of a term, Twilight Hermit Order. However, Klein didn't say a word, nor did he say those words. This was because Admiral Amirius would be him for the next few days. Seeing law weaver Amirius fall into silence, the blurry figure didn't say another word. It turned into a emanating white gas before vanishing from the dream. Chapter 625, Successful First Day Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios Few. What exactly are Amirius and Aston Revolt scheming about? To attract a warning from the Twilight Hermit Order. Unless it can truly change the times and influence the direction of history, this ancient and secretive organization wouldn't even show itself or reveal its identity. Klein stood by the side of a magnificent castle in his dream, thoughtfully watching the spot where the blurry figure had disappeared from. Amidst his thoughts, he suddenly snapped awake and was no longer as certain about his theory. The ploy which Admiral Amirius and his brother are planning might not really influence the trends of the times. Although the Twilight Hermit Order only involves itself in important matters, as a leader of another secret organization, Klein clearly knew that apart from carrying out the organization's own mission and values, it also provided help among members. From Emperor Rosel's diary, I can tell that the Twilight Hermit Order has members from different domains, standings, and sequences. Apart from a number of them fervently believing in the original creator as they await the coming of twilight and the awakening of the true God, the rest are only seeking to benefit themselves. Under such circumstances, as long as the organizer doesn't strictly implement order, there would naturally be missions entrusted between one another. Perhaps, the matter Aston Revolt is planning affects a particular member of the Twilight Hermit Order who was made aware of it ahead of time. He entrusted the matter to another member and used the excuse of the trend of the times to warn Amirius Revolt. Working from this logic, the concealed matter is rather interesting. With the level of the Twilight Hermit Order, Law Weaver Amirius, who's likely only a sequence 4, isn't too difficult a target to eliminate. I even suspect that they can mobilize up to 3 or more angels in a manner that's far superior to the 7 churches. Then, why didn't they take action directly and instead gave an advanced warning? Back in Backland, if an angel were to appear, who knows if some true god would descend upon the land. Therefore, the Twilight Hermit Order had no choice but to use a more roundabout and discreet method to deal with Duke Negan. But this is the Oravi Island. Even high-sequence Beyonders aren't stationed here. The warning is because the Twilight Hermit Order advocates secrecy and doesn't wish to expose itself, so they're trying not to use overly intense methods, or is it the case that the member who assigned the mission doesn't wish to see Amirius killed? To him, this admiral is still of use, so he's unwilling to give up on him, even if Amirius might be involved in something disadvantageous towards him. Then, his true identity seems to be confined to certain circles. Klein made a bold assumption, but with no way of verifying it, he could only temporarily put the matter aside and throw it to the back of his mind. It has nothing to do with me since it's the Twilight Hermit Order who's warning Admiral Amirius. As long as I don't involve myself with anything for the next few days, I should be able to last until the mission is completed. Everything else that develops afterward has nothing to do with me. With my present status, I'm still far from investigating the Twilight Hermit Order. I don't even have the right to probe deeper. Klein kept to his beliefs and turned his sights to his tarot club. I just discovered a problem. Other secret organizations have their own aims and values at their core while mixing in the aid that members provide each other. As for our tarot club, it's more impressive. There are only missions given to each other, without any aims or values. No, there are aims and values among some of the members. For example, my dear Moon believes that this is an organization born to save the world. The fool Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh before exiting the dreamscape. He rubbed away the fake eyes and moved his real eyes back to their original position in a very fluid motion when he suddenly paused. That wasn't a simple dream infiltration. Klein frowned slightly as he recalled what had happened. That was because the power had first attempted to pull him into a deep slumber. Back then, I had already fallen asleep, so why would he do so? Captain once said that a nightmare can directly see a dream, so it's impossible to commit such a mistake. Therefore, the visitor hadn't used the beyonder powers of a nightmare, but something else. He located me via the spirit world. Or after he knew my location, he used the sea of collective subconscious, as described by Ma'am Daly, to directly influence my beyonder powers. Yes. I'm more inclined to the second reason. That's the only thing that can explain why I couldn't escape my dream despite having regained lucidity. It's recorded in Emperor Rosel's diary that during his participation in the suspected Twilight Hermit Order, his entry into the gathering was based on a realistic dreamscape that encompassed the entire continent. A realistic dreamscape. Klein nodded and chuckled silently with a sigh. Admiral Amirius definitely didn't expect the Twilight Hermit Order's warning. It's only because he hired me. If it were anyone else, the stand-in would have already been exposed. That ninth law charm was well worth it. City of Silver, inside the spire, in the room belonging to Chief Colin Iliad. Derek Berg, who had been summoned, saw the grizzled, scarred demon hunter once again as he felt uneasy. After he finished his greetings, Colin sized him up and asked, "You've advanced?" "Yes, I'm already a Sequence 7 Solar High Priest." Derek had long registered his advancement, so there was no need to hide the matter. Colin's light blue eyes, which had seen the vicissitudes of time, moved away as he casually asked, "Do you have the subsequent potion formulas?" The past Derek would have directly answered, no, but the present him was used to thinking over it before answering. If I say, no, my subsequent advancement with the lack of experience to support it will definitely make me suspicious. But if I were to answer, yes, Chief might ask me to use it to exchange for items so as to nurture more Sun Pathway Beyonders. This will no doubt prove that I'm lying. As Derek's mind raced, he answered sincerely, no. From his point of view, experience could be forged. Colin nodded as if nothing was out of the ordinary. In about 2 months, we'll arrange an exploration mission for you. The team will secure the route and ruins we found with the help of Jack before we make a second clearing. I hope you will receive greater rewards then. Yes, Your Excellency. Just as Derek answered, he suddenly recalled Shepherd Lovia. After daybreak, Klein changed into his clothes with the help of Cynthia, enjoyed a sumptuous breakfast, and took the carriage under the escort of the Admiral's bodyguards to the Oravi Naval Base. In the morning, under the companionship of the rear admirals and colonels, he inspected the conditions of the ships, ordnance stores, the newly built training grounds, and the bathroom which had been renovated 20 times over the past year. After having lunch at the Navy Mess Hall, Klein followed the schedule and summoned all officers above the rank of major to take in their reports. During this process, he had a thick black-bound notebook placed in front of him. Inside were some of the questions that Admiral Amirius had specially prepared for him. In the past few decades, due to the embezzlement of salaries and the harsh conditions sailors suffer, Oravi has had 17 revolts by the lower ranks. After the passing of the Imperial Navy latest act, and thanks to Your Excellency's guidance, we've already had such deep-seated cultural issues improved. There haven't been any such cases in the past 3 years. A colonel from the Oravi Naval Base stood on the spot and reported the entire situation. He would raise his head from time to look at Admiral Amirius Revolt and discovered that he was listening very seriously while taking notes. The scribbling sounds made none of the officers dare to not be at their best. Similarly, they took note of the important points. The colonel who received a positive response unknowingly spoke up louder while reporting. How boring. Klein held his fountain pen and had randomly drawn creatures like turtles, cuttlefish, and dragons on his black-bound notebook. As he had never studied sketching before, his drawings were a ghastly sight to see. Later on, he even drew intersecting lines and began playing 5 in a row with himself, a game created by Emperor Roselle. Of course, his rich experience and his conscientiousness of his identity made him raise his head from time to give the reporter a stern look in the eye while giving a nod of encouragement. As for what the person had said, he didn't pay any attention to it. All he did was occasionally remember a few words. During the briefing, Klein shot a glance at the blonde secretary, Juan, to get him to represent himself to mention a few points that needed clarification. Everything followed the schedule. Towards the end, Klein flipped the black-bound notebook a few pages forward and used the accent of a lone aristocrat to recite the report which the secretary had drafted and the admiral had edited. Then, according to the actual situation, he used the common terms Amirius would use and added a few conjunctions and pet phrases, such as, "there are a few points," and "let me continue on a few more points." It was already evening by the time the briefing ended. Under Juan's companionship, Klein left the Oroville Naval Base and headed for the residence of a naval supplier where a banquet was held. At the banquet, they casually chatted about the price fluctuations of port goods. As for Klein, he mimicked Admiral Amirius, and he would mention a dated joke from Backland from time to time, garnering a warm response from everyone as he was praised for his humor. After successfully acting until the banquet ended, Klein boarded the carriage, feeling exhausted in body and mind. "I have to take note of my speech and actions every minute and second. Engaging in true acting for a day is more tiring than battling a pirate admiral." Klein silently sighed, as he closed his eyes halfway without a change in expression. He knew that the most difficult stage of the day wasn't over. He still had to deal with Cynthia. Inside the villa, Cynthia learned from the attendant who had gone out to make inquiries that Admiral Amirius was about to return. She quietly returned to her bedroom, took out the tiny black rhinoceros horn pendant, and used a metallic plate to scratch off tiny bits of powder, mixing it into the hot water inside a white porcelain teacup. After repeating the honorific name of the Mother Tree of Desire 7 times, she waited nearly a minute before lifting the teacup in hope, cleanly downing it. Chapter 626, Amirius's Decision Translator, Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. Looking at the lights emanating out from the villa in the darkness, Klein spent several seconds mentally preparing himself before alighting the carriage. He followed the 3-layered staircase and came to the door, where the admiral's bodyguards and servants were lined up at the sides, before stepping in. Seeing Cynthia wearing conservative home clothes due to the existence of others, Klein silently heaved a sigh of relief as he maintained his stoic expression and slowly walked over. Cynthia's smile became more and more brilliant as she shifted the strands of her hair to the back of her ear, revealing her fair and slender neck. Her neckline didn't have any marks left behind by a necklace. Seeing Secretary Luan and the Admiral's bodyguards head for their own rooms or moving outside the building to take up their patrolling positions, Klein pulled Cynthia into an embrace and said in a deep voice, "There's no need to prepare any hot water. Give me a quiet room. I need to spend the night alone." Cynthia used her eyes to express her puzzlement and blankness. Klein surveyed his surroundings and softly said, "Something unexpected happened. I need to enter an extremely quiet state to recover." As he spoke, he raised his right hand to pull at his collar, revealing a patch of faint-colored fleshy granules. His problematic physical condition with an abnormal reaction was an excuse Admiral Amirius had prepared for the tramp stand-in, so as to avoid Cynthia's attempts of intimacy without exposing a problem. To make it more convincing, Klein used his faceless powers to provide evidence. Cynthia turned agape as she nearly screamed. Thankfully, she covered her mouth in time and held it in. The moment Cynthia recovered from her shock, she immediately asked nervously, her concern and emotions evident, "Are you fine? Do you need to see a doctor?" "No, this is the price needed for powerful strength. I'll recover given 2 to 3 days of solitude." Klein had already found the excuse needed for the future. "Oh, okay. Cynthia hurriedly helped Klein up to the second floor and led him into the quietest room. As for the master bedroom, she had already lit some scented candles and scattered some faint-smelling extract, so she didn't offer him some. Seeing the door close, Klein slowly exhaled. He changed out of his admiral's uniform and lied down in satisfaction. Not far away in the master bedroom, the worried and disappointed Cynthia was soaking herself in hot water before sleeping. She looked at the ceiling with an unfocused gaze as she couldn't help but recall the exhortations of her parents from a few days ago. They wanted her to charm Admiral Amirius and hopefully be impregnated with his child. This way, their family would be able to take on more businesses with the Central Sonia Seas Naval Fleet. Admiral seems to have many matters hidden in his heart, so much that something abnormal has happened to his body. Cynthia's thoughts wandered as they slowly dispersed. Without her realizing it, she had fallen asleep. During this period, she found her digestive system turning warm as her body felt a little hot. In her dream, she seemed to see a pitch-black sky which was dotted with resplendent stars. One of them seemed to notice her gaze as it produced a brighter glow. The next morning, the invigorated Klein enjoyed a sumptuous breakfast which was nothing spectacular to speak of. Once again, he was surrounded by the Admiral's bodyguards as he arrived at the Orovie Naval Base and was placed in the most luxurious and spacious office. According to Admiral Amirius's habits, he would spend some alone time every 2 or 3 days to study and master his beyonder powers to a deeper extent and produce more effective techniques. Therefore, Klein spent most of the day without being disturbed, with him only needing to handle some simple work. Inside the quiet and spacious office, Klein leisurely paced about or flipped through books from the bookshelf. From time to time, he would put his palm into his pockets to touch the 9th law charm to release some of its powerful might. This was to make Secretary Luan, who was outside, believe that there was nothing wrong with Admiral Amirius. After some time, Klein felt sleepy and decided to take a short nap. At this moment, he heard knocking at the door. "There's something important." Klein frowned. Something that made Secretary Luan disturb Admiral Amirius's focus training was definitely nothing simple. "Come in," Klein converged his emotions and answered with a deep voice. The handsome blond man, Luan, turned the handle and entered. He held a telegram in his hand. He said with a suppressed voice, "Your Excellency, a telegram from Backlund. Mr. Aston has been relieved of his post as Governor-General. He will temporarily be replaced by the City Council's chairman. It said that the new Governor-General will arrive today. Aston Revolt has been relieved of his post as Governor-General. Has their secret been discovered?" "That's right. The Twilight Hermit Order has already warned me, no, Amirius. It means that they had long grasped the actual matter. With another member cranking the wheel, the matter will likely go through a series of position changes, putting an end to the matter. A warning was given the previous night, and action was taken today. They must have prepared for quite a while. Yes, that can be seen from the fact that the new Governor-General will arrive today." Klein was first alarmed before he felt that the matter was within reason. He mimicked the attitude Admiral Amirius would have when faced with a major problem by pacing back and forth before saying with a stern expression, "I'm aware." Klein didn't express his views or pass any orders, appearing extremely staid. However, it was because he hadn't decided on a response. We have a saying from the Foodaholic Empire, "Moving is not as good as staying put." I wonder if Roselle had translated this. Klein lampooned as he gave a self-deprecating jest. Luan raised his head and glanced at Admiral Amirius without saying a word before silently leaving the office. Phew. Klein paced about once again as he considered what Admiral Amirius would do if he were standing here. This was something important that had happened outside of his expectations, therefore, Klein could only infer from Amirius's character, experiences, as well as some of the personal descriptions in the information provided to him. He's a conservative person. Even while he was a mid- and low-sequence beyonder and was on all kinds of different ships, he very rarely took risks. He believes himself to be a lone aristocrat who values family, children, and emotions. He's a gentleman who's of good bearing and garners the affection of women. This point is open to debate. With his standing and status, even a curly-haired baboon would garner the affection of men and women, no, perhaps even more. At the very least, a curly-haired baboon doesn't tell dated jokes. Information ran through Klein's mind as they intertwined to form a multifaceted image of Admiral Emerius. While in his deep thought, he heard knocking at his door once again. "Come in." Klein instantly tensed up. One entered and pointed outside. "Your Excellency, Mr. Aston wishes to meet you." "Why is Aston here?" "He came to Emerius to seek his protection." "Or does he plan on making a desperate struggle?" Klein narrowed his eyes slightly, realizing that he couldn't make a decision for Admiral Emerius. What would he do? After receiving a warning from the Twilight Hermit Order, he should already realize that the matter has been exposed. The target was long prepared, so with his conservative nature, it can be imagined that his decision would be. However, he greatly values family. He even provided some of Aston Revolt's interesting tidbits. It's not hard to tell that there's the concern and love for his younger brother in this matter. He doesn't like cannabis and tobacco. Drinking is just for socializing purposes. Apart from being a little caught up with beautiful women, there's nothing seriously wrong with him. He greatly values family. Family. Klein's thoughts raced as he fully immersed himself in Emerius's identity, fully experiencing his hidden feelings for his family and the importance he placed on it. Family. At that instant, he seemed to turn into Emerius, but he was able to analyze the various problems in a detached manner. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, Klein heard himself using a somewhat unfamiliar tone, saying, "Tell him that I have many matters to deal with. I don't have the time to meet him. Also, buy him a ticket back to Backlund." One seemed to have expected it as he retracted his gaze and replied, as though everything was normal, "Yes, Your Excellency." As he watched Luan leave the office to find Aston Revolt outside, Klein gently sighed like the real Emerius Revolt. He knew that Emerius would have made the same choice if he had returned early. This was family, something he valued greatly. With their scheme completely exposed, there was no way Emerius would have exhausted his last chip on a bet and place his family at risk of destruction. As long as he didn't participate in it, and as long as he's still a demigod, the Revolt family wouldn't suffer any overly serious damage even if he isn't able to remain as the highest commander of Central Sonia Sea. And to get his secretary to buy his tickets for him made it clear that Emerius still treated Aston as his brother. It was a warning to others not to harm him before they figured out what was happening. After nearly a minute, one returned and said, "Your Excellency, Mr. Aston has left. Emerius greatly values family." Klein fell silent for 2 seconds before asking in a deep voice, his back facing his secretary, "Did he say anything?" One answered truthfully, "He said that you are indeed a cold person by nature." The corners of Klein's lips curled slightly as he produced an unfeeling smile. This was an instinctive reaction, however, with him completely in character as Emerius, he believed that the Admiral would have had the same reaction. The feeling and emotions were the same. For the rest of the time, Klein sat in his office and didn't meet anyone, nor did he deal with any official business. All he did was occasionally listen to his secretary report to him about the situation on Oravi Island. Nothing happened until the arrival of the new Governor-General. In the evening, he didn't attend the banquet he was supposed to attend, and he returned to his villa. As he saw Cynthia walk towards him, he hugged her. Then, he calmly said, "Aston has been relieved of his post as Governor-General." All his sighs and pain seemed to be condensed into that seemingly emotionless sentence. "I heard about it. It should be fine, right?" Cynthia asked anxiously. Klein closed his eyes and didn't mention it again. All he did was give soft, terse reply. That sentence was the most obvious expression of his emotions as a stern, old-fashioned, and conservative high-ranking man. Chapter 627, Late into the Night. Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios' Cynthia could vaguely sense the deep pain and helplessness inside Admiral Amirius's heart. Without speaking further, she hugged him tightly and used her company to calm his mood. After a simple dinner, Klein took a hot bath and entered the quietest guest room once again. He got into bed and stared at the ceiling in a daze. Klein knew that with him having fully immersed himself in the character of Admiral Amirius, Amirius's helplessness towards fate and the pain he needed to hide had resonated with his past experiences. If I hadn't figured out the concept of getting into character and being detached, then I might have lost myself. Heh, this is like some actors in my past life. They get too into character and are unable to detach themselves from it, causing them to suffer from mental problems. And to a beyonder, mental problems might end up magnified. As Klein wallowed in his gloom, he got to learn what kind of person he was. I never expected that a Navy admiral who enjoys a high standing, a demigod saint, would still be faced with such helpless and painful experiences. Strength can bring abundance, but it's not a solution to everything. Everyone wears masks, and this is the truest side of a demigod. Klein watched as the crimson moonlight turned brighter, dyeing all the furniture in the room red. At that moment, through the resonating feelings with Admiral Amirius's experience and the contrasting differences, as well as the experience from his previous acting, Klein established a more multifaceted and realistic image of Amirius. He also gained a clearer picture of his blurry self. A person who's very sentimental, a person from Earth, but to a certain extent, a person who has been reconstructed into a new person because of the fusion with Klein Moretti's memory fragments, a person who didn't spend too much time with the Nighthawks but has had that period of time deeply influence his actions and choices, a person who tries to play safe and is afraid of danger but is able to change his mind at the critical moment, a person who truly wants to skive, eat delicious food, travel, and enjoy life, but he has no choice but to be busy with more important matters. A person who likes beautiful women, but he doesn't give himself up to pleasure to keep to his principles, a person who loves money but is willing to spend large sums of money for his siblings, a person who hides his pain inside while showing a smile to others, a person who's used to lampooning inwardly but appears gentlemanly on the surface, a person who can overcome his psychological traumas but never crosses his bottom line, a person who feels embarrassed for his acting. He's also a guardian, a miserable wretch that is constantly fighting against threats and madness. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he silently added. These thoughts flashed through his mind as he seemed to come into contact with his true self. Without realizing it, Klein fell asleep, his body and mind at peace. Inside the master bedroom, Cynthia had also fallen asleep. She was dressed in a nightgown with her legs bare. She had a few layers of her blanket in between her legs as she gently grinded against them. Her hand subconsciously scratched her skin, forming red streaks across them as tiny bumps were produced. In her dream, she saw the illusory and surreal sea of stars, as well as that bright star that emitted its light at her. Her vision was pulled closer to it as she could slowly discern the star. Phew! Klein suddenly awoke from his dream as he still had an indescribable scene still seemingly burned into his eyes. Why did I have such a dream? He frowned as he turned his head in disbelief. Just now, not only had he dreamed of Cynthia, who was dressed in a silk nightgown, but he also had a sexual relationship with her. He even dreamed of the naked body of Demoness of Pleasure Sharon, the exquisite doll-like Miss Sharon, Miss Justice whose looks were relatively blurry, Trissy Cheek, Tracy, and all the beautiful women he had met before. Then, he gave himself up to pleasure as he engaged in a myriad of positions. To most beyonders and ordinary people, this might have been a normal response from suppressing his body when recently faced with temptation, but as a seer, a dream had a very special meaning. Klein quickly observed his body and realized he was still erect, semen flooding out from his penis and causing stains everywhere. This isn't a seer's dream revelation, but the result of an external influence. There's an enemy. Klein was alarmed as he quickly made up his mind. At the same time, he cautiously got out of bed and quickly changed into his admiral uniform. This way, he had the ninth law charm and creeping hunger on him, equipping him with potent self-preservation powers. As he wasn't clear of the present situation, Klein didn't attempt to head above the gray fog. He continued viewing himself as Amirius. With a staid expression, Klein carefully walked to the door and reached out his hand to grab the handle. At that instant, he seemed to finally find the connection with the real world as he heard the chaos and din outside the door. There were clear chewing sounds, debaucherous moaning, angry roaring, and sharp urging. What exactly happened? Everything was normal just moments ago. Klein gulped a mouthful of saliva as he used cogitation to maintain the necessary calm. He had been using spirit vision to observe the situation outside the villa every day and had not discovered any problems. Where are the Admiral's bodyguards? Where's Secretary Luan? Klein found the entire ordeal strange and terrifying the more he considered the situation before him. He touched the ninth law charm with one hand and made the deep domineering aura emanate, repressing the unease that was wafting through the air. Exerting strength in his left hand, Klein twisted the handle and opened the door. Before he took a step forward, he saw a red-vested attendant sitting opposite him. The attendant had many cooked and raw food placed in front of him. There was steak, mutton, dragonbone fish, and Oravi lobster. At this moment, the attendant picked up a huge fish that seemed to have just stopped struggling, raised his head, and smiled at Klein with a turbid look. "Admiral, I have always envied your food." His stomach was different from before. It was bloated as though he was 7 or 8 months pregnant. Just as he said that, the attendant raised his arms and bit into the raw dragonbone fish, forcefully ripping out a piece of thick flesh. Fresh red blood dribbled from the corners of his mouth as his chewing sounds sent a chill down Klein's back. The attendant hurriedly gulped as he swallowed the food in his mouth. His bloated stomach trembled as though he would blow up at any moment. This is the instinctive reaction to restrict one's appetite. Klein observed the attendant carefully, and for some reason, he recalled the tramp stand-in who had died of a sudden illness due to gorging. He didn't spend too much time thinking or making attempts to rescue the attendant who was ravenously consuming the food. This was because he knew that nothing would be effective unless he resolved the matter at its roots. Klein moved his feet and followed his spiritual intuition's guidance, carefully walking towards the master bedroom. At the door, there were 2 maidservants. One of them was sitting on the other as she bent her back, strangling the other by the neck. Wearing a beaming smile, she shook the maidservant beneath her as she hurriedly urged her, quickly praise me. Quickly praise me. She desires acknowledgement." Klein frowned and took a few steps closer, grabbing onto the collar of the maidservant at the very top. He threw the maidservant to the other side of the wall, slamming her to the wall with a force strong enough to make anyone faint. However, this didn't prevent the maidservant from getting to her feet. The maidservant at the bottom kept yawning without opening her eyes. Even though her neck was being wrangled, she appeared as though she hadn't had enough sleep. Such a scene. Klein instantly had the urge to escape and seek help from the church or military. However, the strongest person on Oravi Island was none other than Admiral Amirius. And I'm Amirius at the moment. However, once the situation turns for the worse, I should flee when the time calls for it. I shouldn't act at the cost of my life. Klein pushed open the ajar master bedroom door, his scalp tingling with numbness. The first thing he heard behind the door was pleasurable moaning that gave itself up to one's primal instincts. Following that, a smell that made his heart race and sent blood gushing to his nether regions inundated his olfactory senses. In addition, there was an eclectic mix of all sorts of bodily fluids. A scene of indulging pleasure couldn't help but surface in Klein's mind. Right on the heels of that, Klein saw the blonde secretary, Juan. He stood by the door, looking inside with an overlooking and cold manner. His arrogance was extremely real. Upon sensing someone enter, he turned his head and discovered it was Admiral Amirius. His expression and gaze didn't change, as though he was looking at an ordinary, unimportant person. This secretary is usually very reverent, but he's actually such a prideful person. Klein originally wanted to question one who seemed to possess some reason, but he saw him shift his gaze to look into the middle of the master bedroom from a height. He only looks normal. Klein traced Luan's gaze and discovered a fair body that was 3 meters tall in the middle of the master bedroom. It had brownish-green lumps growing on its surface that resembled tree warts. Some parts were cracked open, revealing organs that resembled flowers. It had the bodyguards and the male attendants gathered around it as they either stood or knelt, prostrating or floating as they mated with those organs, letting out deep grunting sounds. The other bodyguards and maidservants of varying numbers were scattered across the carpet, enjoying each other's bodies to their heart's content. In addition, tree warts and flowers grew from the tall fair body, as well as brown branches that extended out as they participated in every promiscuous act of pleasure with the people present. What kind of monster is this? Klein had his knowledge of mysticism overturned once again. He lowered his left palm and prepared for battle. At this moment, the terrifying body which towered 3 meters tall turned a head over. It was a female. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She had a high nose bridge and plump lips. She was none other than the beautiful Cynthia with hints of her youthfulness. As the tree branches danced while the flowers opened, Cynthia looked down at Klein with flushed cheeks as she said with hints of embarrassment, "Admiral, I want to have a child with you." Chapter 628, Prohibition Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Upon seeing Cynthia's huge fair body with tree warts and flowers growing on it as though she was a tree, as well as hearing her shy, reluctant request, Klein couldn't help but shudder as his hair stood on end. Such a scene exceeded a horror conceivable by human imagination. He had never encountered something like this even in his dreams. If he were himself back when facing Megos in Tinjin, Klein definitely would have been affected by such a scene. He would have temporarily lost his ability to react due to the horror and panic, but after experiencing so much, he was an experienced beyonder in the true sense of the word. In the moment that Cynthia's words entered his ears, the glove on his left hand had already changed colors. It had turned black, emitting a noble and sinister feeling. This meant that Klein had activated creeping hunger and had switched to Wormtongue Mither Soul, giving him the powers of a Baron of Corruption. At that instant, he distorted Cynthia's words, turning "Admiral, I want to have a child with you," to "Admiral, I only wish to have a child with you." This way, Klein believed that the bodyguards and male attendants around the tree-like monster would be pushed away, far away by Cynthia, after having her will distorted, giving them a chance for a breather. As for whether he would expose himself as a fake Admiral Amirius, he didn't care. At this moment, anyone who was still bothered about whether the true acting would be successful would definitely be someone with a serious case of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and he clearly wasn't. In addition, in an environment with all sorts of desires being magnified to the limit, Klein suspected that the others who had been influenced weren't paying attention to the battle or the actual situation. The Baron of Corruption's distortion power was activated silently, but Klein was appalled to discover that nothing changed with Cynthia or the men's actions. They weren't affected at all. "I've already used distortion. The mutated Cynthia is able to directly resist such an influence." Klein's pupils constricted as he hurriedly jumped to the side. A brown tree branch sprouted out from where he was standing as a sticky flower bloomed at its tip. The flower was abnormally large. As it bloomed, it seemed like it was about to swallow a person whole. Although Klein had never seen cannibalistic flowers in the southern continent's rainforests, he didn't believe that they were any less terrifying or ridiculous as the one before him. Pa! 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 Similar branches drilled out from the walls, floor, and ceiling as they chased after Klein with their moist flowers. During this process, the flowers bit down on Secretary Luan's head, as well as the bodyguards, male attendants, and maidservants who were gyrating in pleasure on the surrounding carpet. At this moment, having learned the lesson that his distortion powers would be resisted, Klein didn't hesitate to pull out his right hand, a dark gold high-level charm clasped tightly in his palm. Ninth Law. He originally didn't plan on using the charm so quickly. It wasn't because he couldn't bear to use it, but he wished to engage in a longer battle to determine what Cynthia was good at after mutating into a monster. Only then could he target her weaknesses. After all, the ninth law was unable to make a general prohibition, and the clause had to be sufficiently specific. For example, it couldn't make Beyonder powers ineffective in the area, but it could specify the nullification of a specific Beyonder power. To use it to its fullest, he needed to observe carefully and make sound judgment. However, the present situation was forcing Klein to use his trump card. Otherwise, he suspected that he had no means of damaging this tree-like monster. If the ninth law charm isn't able to create an environment that allows me to kill the monster, I'll have to immediately escape from the villa with its help. I will lead Cynthia outside and find a chance to pray. I'll use the sea god scepter above the grey fog to bombard it with attacks. Just as the thought flashed in his mind, Klein, who had been constantly jumping amidst the attacking tree branches and flowers, solemnly chanted a word in ancient Hermes, law. As the activation incantation resounded, the dark gold charm in Klein's palm instantly turned ice cold. It was a coldness that seemed to make one lose any emotions. At that instant, Klein reached an extremely calm state. In the moment he threw out the ninth law charm, his thoughts rapidly surfaced as he considered what to prohibit. His first reaction was to prohibit the generation of any desire, but he knew that it was too general. Therefore, he thought of changing to the desire to procreate. After all, Cynthia's desire was to have a child with Admiral Amirius. The influence she had on her surroundings was a result of this. Just as the ninth law charm was flying in midair, turning into bits of dark gold beams of light that scattered into the surroundings, Klein suddenly thought of a problem. Cynthia was only an ordinary person prior to this. This is a certain fact. Over the past 3 nights, Klein had used spirit vision, divination, and other methods to repeatedly confirm that Cynthia wasn't a Beyonder. Similarly, she would have long been discovered by Admiral Amirius, who could distinguish between ordinary people and Beyonders. Therefore, her sudden transformation into a mutated monster was a problem he needed to pay close attention to. Could it be like Megos? She became a vessel of an evil god's descent through some form of ritual. No, if there's a ritual, it's impossible for me not to discover it. My spiritual intuition would have warned me not to activate my spirit vision and not look straight at Cynthia. It's some item or trait on her body that has an external force projected on her. Therefore, there weren't any problems the previous 2 nights until she suddenly mutated today. Regardless, the terror from her comes from somewhere else and not her body. Klein quickly made a judgment in 2 seconds. Without any hesitation, he seized the opportunity and said in a solemn tone, "This place is prohibited from having any interaction with the outside world." The ancient Hermes words, which were filled with mystery, instantly spread out as the dark golden light scattered everywhere and intertwined with the countless law-like symbols and magic labels before merging into the void. Hum. There was suddenly a light hum in Klein's ears as he seemed to see the formless light filled with desire get expelled out of the room. Immediately following that, an illusory and resplendent starry sky appeared before his eyes. They were points of bright stars. Pa! Pa! Klein's eyes burst as fluid, a mixture of blood and plasma, gushed out horrendously. Although he had used the ninth law charm to isolate any external influence, the level of the power was extremely high. Just a normal level of recoil was enough to penetrate the natural protection of the high-level charm and burst his eyes. This damage came abruptly and without any warning signs. Klein didn't even have the chance to use paper figurine substitutes, just like Nimblewright Master Rosago from back then. If not for the ninth law charm, his eyes might not have been the only things that burst. He might have turned into a monster just like Cynthia. Meanwhile, the tree-like Cynthia came to a stop as her body began crumbling, turning into flesh and blood with brownish-green warts. The surrounding bodyguards and male attendants plopped to the ground, unconscious. Cynthia's head was embedded in the blob of flesh as she muttered to herself, "Admiral, I want to have a child with you. "Admiral, I want to have a child with you." She tried hard to extend the remaining tree branches on the ceiling and walls, binding Klein, who was still in a dazed state as a result of the recoil, and she pulled him towards herself. The moment Klein recovered a little, he immediately began struggling desperately. Despite his attempts to snap his fingers to light a fire or switch the powers of creeping hunger, he failed because his hands and arms were bound tightly. With the help of his clown powers, he saw the brownish-green warts approach. Stirred, Klein changed his appearance, turning his appearance from Admiral Amirius to Gehrman Sparrow, a Gehrman sparrow with bleeding eyes. The binding tree branches paused as they mysteriously released their hold. They began flailing everywhere as though in an attempt to grab at something. Cynthia's head was filled with disappointment and confusion as she muttered, "Admiral, where did you go? Admiral, where did you go?" Without the external force to continue the resistance, she finally only had the thoughts of having a child with Amirius thanks to the Baron of Corruption's distortion. This made her release Gehrman Sparrow. Klein flipped to his feet and covered his eyes with his right hand and pulled downwards abruptly, moving the horrendous wound towards his left shoulder. As his left shoulder became mangled, creeping hunger was tainted with a pure and resplendent glow. Klein looked at Cynthia's head in the pile of flesh and blood with pity as he spread out his arms. A holy flame which swirled around a pillar of pure light descended from the sky, enveloping the monster that had been reduced to flesh and blood. Chapter 629, Heavenly Body Sect Translator, Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. Amidst the holy beam of light, having already lost its support from the external power, the tree warts and flesh rapidly disintegrated. It was like snow meeting a red-hot metal ball. Amidst an indescribable sizzling sound, Cynthia's face winced as abnormal agony showed itself on her face. She turned around with great difficulty, looking up and down, her expression turning horrified and confused. Finally, she realized that there was a problem with her. "Admiral," her voice trembled as she looked ahead with fear and despair, but all she could find was an unfamiliar face. Klein could have fed creeping hunger with Cynthia's remnant flesh and spirit body, but at that moment, he sighed and said with a calm voice, "Try not to make contact with strange artifacts or religions in the future." From his point of view, the reason why Cynthia had turned into this monstrosity either had to do with a cult or some particularly dangerous artifact. She had connected with some existence which couldn't be looked at directly, resulting in such a response. Cynthia seemed to understand something as her remnant head and tiny bit of flesh suddenly wept. "It's the mother tree of desire, the heavenly body sect. Admiral, Admiral, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Save me. Save me. Mother tree of desire. Heavenly body sect. This isn't within the confines of my knowledge of mysticism." Klein maintained his expression as he looked pitifully at the pleading Cynthia. He spread his arms again and said in a deep voice, "Death is not the end. You will be redeemed when you are at God's side." Another pure beam of light landed as Cynthia's beautiful, weeping face completely fixed in place. Her eyes widened in despair, but there was the remnant hope of being sent to heaven after death. Under the sun's radiance, her brain and remnant flesh melted away at a discernible pace. By vanishing, it had obtained its final rite of cleansing. Klein looked silently at this scene without any expression or movement. After everything calmed down, he curled the corner of his lips and chuckled, finding it hard to hide his sorrow. This is really a crazy and chaotic world. He didn't dare to channel Cynthia's spirit after what had happened. The many oddities had made him abandon the thought of bringing Cynthia's spirit body above the grey fog to inquire. Faced with the irremovable evil and the ever-worsening corruption, he could only choose to have Cynthia be cleansed. After all, in this world with true gods, there might exist a heaven after death. As for creeping hunger's backlash, Klein was temporarily not concerned. After spending a long time with it, this mystical item which had been sealed to a certain extent had adjusted to him. It didn't need to be fed after every use. It had been restored to its original state. Once it was activated, it just needed to eat once in a 24-hour period, regardless of how many times it was used. Of course, there was no need for it to be fed on the day it wasn't used. Therefore, Klein had plenty of time to seek out food for creeping hunger without harming the innocent. If the worst comes to the worst, I can throw it above the gray fog. Klein surveyed his surroundings, and he realized that the bodyguards and the male and female attendants in the room had shaken off the influence of their magnified desires, and they had fallen unconscious. This included the maidservant who was strangling her companion in a bid to obtain her approval and praise, as well as blonde secretary, Juan. Indeed, once the problem is resolved at its root, everything will come to an end. According to Admiral Amirius's description, Juan is at least a sequence 6 beyonder, and he's suspected to be a baron of corruption. He might have secretly reached sequence 5. Even he was so easily controlled by his magnified desires, which means that the power that descended with the help of Cynthia is extremely potent. But why did I only have a wet dream? Ignoring my mystical items, Juan and I should be at the same level. Is it because a portion of the gray fog's power, when mixed with reality, provided me with help? Is it because of the restriction from Admiral Amirius's temporary contract? Or could it be a mix of both? Yes, if it wasn't because of these factors, as Cynthia's primary target, my desire towards sex would definitely be magnified. This wouldn't just be me having a romantic dream. Klein habitually reached out with his right hand to cover his face as he changed once again back into Amirius Revolt's appearance. As the lives of the others weren't temporarily under threat, he carefully observed the room when his spiritual perception was suddenly triggered. Taking a few steps forward, Klein came to where Cynthia had vanished. He bent down and picked up a necklace from a pile of torn clothes on the bed. A pendant that was the length of a finger segment hung from the necklace. It was completely black in color and looked like a miniaturized rhinoceros horn. Its surface was full and covered in cracks. Apart from exuding evil, there were no lustrous spirituality activity. This is the dangerous item that caused Cynthia to mutate. As it had connected to the existence which couldn't be looked at directly, it had completed its mission, allowing all its powers to be injected into Cynthia's body. Klein made a preliminary conjecture based on the pendant's situation and from his past experience. He checked the area and found nothing. Hence, he pulled out a paper figurine and dealt with the traces left behind. He dispelled the prohibition from the charm before walking towards Secretary Juan, who still had some signs of corruption due to temporarily being devoured by the flowers. He raised his knee and kicked him a few times with the tip of his shoe. With Amirius's character, it's unlikely that he would crouch down to shake his secretary awake. This fellow's arrogant way of looking down on others sure is irritating. I really want to beat him up. Klein paused as he watched sternly as Juan gradually woke up. Your Excellency, Juan was in a momentary daze, as though he couldn't tell dream from reality. As a high-ranking superior, I'm under no obligation to explain. Klein looked down at him and said in a deep voice, wake up all the lightly injured people. Get a number of them to treat the remaining people while the others are to investigate the heavenly body sect on Oravi Island. They worship an evil god named Mother Tree of Desire. Start the investigation with the people around Cynthia. I'll be waiting in the study for the report. With that said, he held the cracked rhinoceros horn pendant and turned to leave the master bedroom before entering the unaffected silent study. As an important member of the military, although he was somewhat helpless when faced with the kingdom's upper echelons, he needed to choose to ignore certain matters. An example was the telegram which relieved Aston from his post as Governor-General and the arrival of the new Governor-General. This meant that the new Governor-General had departed ahead of time, yet as the highest-ranking commander of the Central Sonia Seas Navy, Amirius Revolt had not received the news at all. However, on Oravi Island, to Secretary Juan and the local police system and naval base personnel, he still held absolute authority. He didn't need to do the investigations himself, as he had plenty of people at his disposal. A demigod only needed to be wary against any accidents and await news. There was no need to busy themselves. Inside the study, as Klein heard the chaotic sound of footsteps and horrified screams, questioning, and exchanges, he couldn't help but have the starry sky and the bright, lustrous star surface in his mind. What does it represent? Klein frowned and sat in the armchair behind the desk. His figure sank into the darkness brought about by the curtains. He soon made certain connections. Due to the legends from the City of Silver and Emlyn White's description of the sanguine situation, he confirmed that the moon pathway controlled a portion of the authority over reproduction and proliferation. This coincided with Cynthia's intentions and actions. A starry sky. Mr. Dorr informed Emperor Roselle that the goddess's corresponding tarot card is the star and not the moon. Could it be that this illusory starry sky represents her? Yes, the primordial moon is suspected to be a particular deity, angel, or high-level devil's alternate identity. The goddess has the honorific name of Crimson Moon. Could she be the one passing herself off as the primordial moon and occupying the corresponding spot so as to control the required authority? Although Klein knew that such thoughts were sacrilegious, he couldn't help but suspect the Evernight goddess. But he soon rejected that conjecture. This was because, be it vampire ancestor Lilith or the primordial moon, what they projected was only reproduction and proliferation. It didn't include the recognition of gluttony, pride, and desire. This was at odds with a number of victims earlier. The other honorific titles of the Evernight goddess didn't include the corresponding domains. This does coincide with the traits of the devil pathway. A desire apostle is an expert in such matters. Could the one subjugating the primordial moon be a high-level devil, or even the king of devils who's known as the dark side of the universe, Sequence 0 Abyss? This is very possible, but the problem with this is that it shouldn't produce an illusory starry sky and bright stars. Be it moon or abyss, they have nothing to do with the corresponding symbols. Klein found his conjecture problematic the more he thought over the matter. Amidst his thoughts, he suddenly thought of a concept. It was something important back when he was first educated in mysticism but had never received a detailed description or explanation. That was the astral world. Apart from the Life School of Thought and a few other organizations' belief in uncommon concepts such as the world of absolute rationality, most schools of thought in mysticism believed that the world was comprised of the real world, the spirit world, and the astral world. There was no need to explain the real world. Knowledge of the spirit world was the foundation of many ritualistic magic and beyonder powers. It was only the astral world where Klein's knowledge about it was basically zero. Therefore, the illusory starry sky represents the astral world. The bright star is a particular existence in the astral world. I've always suspected that the astral world is where the true gods reside. Then, this imagery which represents the primordial moon isn't something unacceptable. Klein didn't think further as he recalled the details of the past few days while awaiting the results of his subordinates' investigations. Time ticked by when Klein finally heard a familiar gate approach. Secretary Luan knocked before entering. He bowed his head and coldly reported, "Your Excellency. We've already found the Heavenly Body sect and captured their leader." It was a clue provided by Miss Cynthia's parents. This sect has been rather active in Oravi over the past few years. They do not wear clothes, in a bid to return to nature. Giving themselves up to their instincts is their purpose, and they believe that humans can attain liberation of their spirituality in such states. Reproduction of the next generation is a subsidiary product of this belief. After pausing for a moment, Luan added, "Their leader is a beyonder, a Sequence 8 lunatic." Lunatic? A lunatic from the prisoner pathway. It has something to do with the Rose School of Thought. Yes, the Rose School of Thought internally has two factions, temperance, and indulgence. The latter's beliefs are rather identical to the present situation. Klein was alarmed as he said in a stoic tone, "Bring him here." Chapter 630, Timeline Translator, Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. The leader of the Naturism sect was named Flight Ken, a man in his 30s. His thin face had brown whiskers, and there were evil-looking tattoos on his neck. He was brought in front of Klein by Luan. He looked ragged, as though he had suffered the most severe mental torture. "Your Excellency," while he was being captured, he kept exchanging his intelligence for strength, and he's on the brink of a mental collapse. One reported the facts, ignoring the possibility that Admiral Amirius could tell the exact details. "That's perfect." Klein had been previously worried that, as a lunatic, Flight Ken would refuse to answer his questions while under the mental pressure. That way, he had to take the risk of being suspected of dismissing his subordinates and attempting a spirit channeling. As he looked coldly at Flight Ken, Klein's left hand wore a golden luster under the cover of the desk. He had switched creeping hunger to the interrogator's soul. An interrogator happened to be sequence 7 of Admiral Amirius's Arbiter Pathway. Deep in Klein's eyes, 2 indistinct flashes of lightning appeared as they overlapped with Flight Ken's figure. Psychic piercing was poised for attack. However, Klein didn't directly use the Beyonder power, as it was only at the level of a sequence 7. Once he used it in front of Luan, he would immediately expose himself to the blonde secretary. With the pressure provided by psychic piercing on Flight Ken's spirit body, Klein sat there like the real Admiral Amirius as he said in a deep voice, "Do you know Cynthia?" As he spoke, he raised his right hand high and dangled the black miniature rhinoceros horn from his palm. "What is its use?" The dispirited Flight Ken trembled as he felt as if a dagger was being held to his psyche, capable of penetrating him at any moment. He couldn't help but lower his head as he stammered, "Yes, I know her. Cynthia, Miss Cynthia wished to have a child with your Excellency, a child with Beyonder powers. She was introduced to me by her parents. It's a proliferation necklace created with the bestowment of the goddess's aura. By consuming its powder and wearing it for prolonged periods of time, it will be able to make your Excellency unable to resist her." Klein listened in silence as he was half convinced by Flight Ken's explanation. However, he still had his doubts. He believed that it was partially Cynthia's goal. This beautiful lady did wish to have a child with Admiral Amirius, either by her own will or from the urging of others. This could be seen from her persistence even after she mutated. Although the Lone Kingdom's aristocrats didn't like or even discriminated against their illegitimate children, it was situational. A child who had successfully inherited their father's Beyonder characteristics would similarly be given importance. Those ancient families who knew many secrets viewed this with importance, and the Revolt family was one of those families. Furthermore, Admiral Amirius is a stern and old-fashioned man on the surface, but he's someone who treasures his relationships. Even an illegitimate child would receive his love and have importance attached. This might be the real reason why Cynthia was eager to have his child. Klein sighed inwardly. The doubt towards Flight Ken's answer was concentrated on the true effects of the proliferation necklace, as well as the possibility of the naturism sect deliberate misleading of Cynthia. As he strengthened the pressure brought about by psychic piercing, Klein silently stared into Flight Ken's eyes until he could no longer take it and bowed his head again. "What other uses does this necklace have?" Klein shook the cracked pendant. His tone was calm, as though he knew every secret. His questions were only to obtain the final confirmation. An indescribable pressure inundated Flight Ken, who was already on the brink of a mental collapse. He plopped to the ground and shouted nearly hysterically, "It can corrupt you. As long as Cynthia consumed the powder ground from it and sincerely chanted Mother Tree of Desire's honorific name, any man who has sex with her and successfully has a child would be corrupted. That will make you become a believer of the Mother Tree of Desire. To become her blessed. So that's how it is." Klein instantly understood the entire story, and he was no longer puzzled by the mutation that happened that very night. The naturism sect's goal is to use Cynthia and the proliferation necklace, which looks like an ordinary object, to corrupt Admiral Amirius, making this important military figure of the Lone Kingdom become the Mother Tree of Desire's devout believer. He can then help their sect develop and provide them protection. The key to the success of this method is that it's sufficiently concealed and normal. It is in no way directly connected to terms like potency, strike, and terrifying. Therefore, after 3 rejections from me, Cynthia was unable to expel the corruptive forces in the proliferation necklace's powder from her body. She gradually reached her limit and finally connected with the mother tree of desire and ended up with what seemed like a sudden mutation. Therefore, the monster after the mutation wasn't able to pose any threat to the real Admiral Amirius. Even my usage of the 9th law charm easily resolved the matter. This is because this wasn't the outcome the Naturism sect wished to have. They wished to have Admiral Amirius be secretly corrupted, and not have a conflict with a demigod. Klein silently looked at the secretary Luan. Luan had also gained a rough understanding of the entire situation. He immediately lowered his head and said in a deep voice, "Your Excellency, it was our oversight. We only monitored Miss Cynthia and the servants here without expanding the monitoring to their friends and family. I'm willing to accept any punishment for this, even if you send me to be court-martialed." How would the real admiral reply? Klein once again immersed himself in the character of Amirius, experiencing his recent pain, helplessness, grief, and anger. He maintained his seating posture and sternly said, "We shall leave this for later." The hidden meaning behind this sentence meant, "I'll decide based on your upcoming performance." Luan was taken aback for a second, seemingly finding the admiral's mild punishment unbelievable. Klein half closed his eyes and said in a deep voice, "My father, the deceased Earl Revolt, once taught me this. He said to pardon the first mistake of a subordinate. Luan, you, as well as the other bodyguards, should be thankful for his benevolence." Luan's gaze shimmered as he drew a silent breath. He was no longer as calm, as he rather earnestly said, "Your benevolence is admirable. I pledge my utmost loyalty to you, apart from my principles, God, and kingdom. The pride in you is extremely exaggerated." Klein didn't believe him as he said seemingly calm, "There's a second half of the saying, that is, punish them for their second mistake." Luan nodded, unsurprised at that. Klein cast his gaze back to Flight Ken who was slumped on the ground. He pressed without a change in expression, "Who instigated you to do this?" From his point of view, Flight Ken's answer was likely that they had planned it. After coming into contact with Cynthia and learning of her requests and knowing who her lover was, the Naturism sect boldly had the idea of corrupting the naval admiral, Amirius. Flight looked left and right somewhat neurotically as he apprehensively said, It was the mother tree of desire. She instigated me to do it in my dream. In the beginning, I only wanted to lend Cynthia the proliferation necklace and for her to wear it. I never planned on her consumption of the powder. Instigated by the mother tree of desire. This is almost equivalent to a revelation. Klein nearly frowned. Although Admiral Amirius is an important figure of the lone military and the highest-ranking commander of the Central Sonia Sea, making his standing and power rather tremendous, it shouldn't be important enough to have an evil goddess set her sights on him. However, I'm not an evil god. I have no way of comprehending their thought process. Perhaps the corruption of Amirius is for subsequent plans. Yes, I can't eliminate the possibility that Flight Ken is lying. I'll have to confirm it later. Klein thought before sternly asking, "When did you have this dream?" Flight forced a smile filled with fear and said, It was nighttime on February 4th, last Friday. I remember it very clearly. I had just released The Spirituality of a Lady. For February. Klein ruminated over the date, momentarily unable to find anything special about it. After 2 seconds of silence, he turned to ask, "What relationship do you have with the Rose School of Thought? What relationship does the Mother Tree of Desire have with the Chained God?" He wasn't worried that Admiral Amirius might have already known of this, with Secretary Luan having a certain understanding of the matter. This could be easily understood as a confirmation question. Flight Ken revealed a passionate look he could hardly keep in. We're a branch of the Rose School of Thought. My mentor is the Rose School of Thought Saint, Zatwin. The Chained God is another manifestation of the Mother Tree of Desire. The Mother Tree of Desire is the true and only deity that surpasses the 7 gods and the true Creator. Your Excellency, you are a candidate to be, blessed. Who can't brag? Can it be understood that the mother tree of desire is an alt of the chained god? According to the evil spirit in the underground ruins suspected to be Red Angel Medici, the prisoner path of the divine and the devil pathway can be swapped. Therefore, it's no surprise that the Rose School of Thought's chained god can magnify the various desires of creatures. They have the temperance and indulgence factions internally. This matches the situation. Klein thought as he turned his head to Luan and said, "Go out for a while." He planned on questioning Flight Ken on whether he had done anything evil, and if he was suitable to be Creeping Hunger's meal. "Yes, Your Excellency." Luan didn't ask why as he briskly walked out the study and closed the door behind him. After the echoing sound of the door closing subsided, the entire study suddenly turned quiet. It was as though it was isolated from the outside world. The beyonder powers of a baron of corruption. The distortion of door closing to seal the study. Very considerate. Klein pondered for a few seconds as he recalled the series of thoughts he had previously. Hence, he suddenly asked, February 6th. What did you do on Sunday evening? Flight Ken was taken aback as he said, "We followed the revelation given by Mother Tree of Desire, and using the proliferation necklace and a hair obtained from a particular tramp, we held a ritual to magnify the tramp's gluttony. The tramp stand-in meant for Admiral Amirius was indeed killed by you. It was to prevent the Admiral from leaving and, hence, fall into a trap so that he can have sex with Cynthia and end up being corrupted?" Klein instantly connected all the matters together. And my appearance provided another possibility that coincidentally destroyed this plan. Coincidence? That's not right. When the words, coincidence, flashed in his mind, Klein suddenly recalled the peculiarity of February 4th, the day the Mother Tree of Desire gave Flight Ken a dream revelation. It was the first day he arrived on Oravi Island.